On the first day the Van Doren Rubber Company opened for business, the customers picked out their shoes, watched them get made in the back of the shop, and then stood at the register, waiting to pay. Paul Van Doren had forgotten to put money in the cash register. He had no change to give. So he told the customers to take the shoes home and come back tomorrow to pay. And every single one of them did. That moment, on March 16th, 1966, in a small factory store in Anaheim, California, tells you everything you need to know about how Vans was built. On trust, on improvisation, and on the absolute conviction that if you made a good shoe and sold it directly to the person wearing it, the business would take care of itself. It did for almost 20 years, until Paul handed the company to his younger brother James, who nearly destroyed it in 3, and the resulting bankruptcy split the Van Doren family permanently, with Paul later saying he had not seen his brother since the day they bought him out. In today's episode, we show how the Van Doren saga proves that even when you build a $2 billion shoe empire from a single factory in Anaheim, you cannot survive handing the keys to the wrong member of your own family. Vans is one of those brands that has become so embedded in everyday life that people forget someone actually had to invent it. The checkerboard slip-on alone has sold in quantities that would make most fashion houses weep. A shoe so simple in its design that a child can draw it from memory, and so durable in its cultural relevance that it has been continuously popular for over 4 decades, without a single redesign. Under VF Corporation, which acquired the brand in 2004 for roughly $396 million, Vans grew into a global powerhouse, generating $2.2 billion in annual revenue by 2015, making it comfortably VF's most profitable brand in a portfolio that includes the North Face, Timberland, and Dickies. The shoes sell in over 80 countries. The brand sponsors skateboarding competitions, music festivals, and art exhibitions on every continent. The Warped Tour, which Vans title-sponsored for over 2 decades, introduced an entire generation of teenagers to punk rock, while simultaneously ensuring that every kid in the mosh pit was wearing the same vulcanized rubber soles. The brand's cultural footprint extends from professional skateboarding to BMX to surf to the entire universe of action sports, and its logo, that clean italic script, is one of the most recognized marks in global youth culture. And yet the family who created all of this, the Van Dorens, no longer own a single share. They sold the company in 1988 for $74.4 million, a figure that looks almost quaint against the billions in revenue the brand now generates, and the sale came only 3 years after the company had crawled out of bankruptcy. What makes the Van Doren story unusual is not the loss of ownership, because that happens to founding families constantly, and it is rarely interesting when it does. What makes this story different is what happened afterwards. Steve Van Doren, Paul's son, still works at Vans as Vice President of Events and Promotions, serving as the public face of the brand at every major skateboarding and music event. Cheryl Van Doren, Paul's daughter, is Vice President of Human Resources. Grandchildren Christy Van Doren and Jenny Battiest hold senior roles in marketing and merchandising. The deeper stories of families who built brands worth billions and then watched them slip away fill our free Substack newsletter, which you can access through the first link in the video description below. But the Van Dorens did something almost no founding family manages. They lost the company and kept the culture. They gave up the equity and held onto the soul, and somehow, 3 generations later, that trade still looks like a good deal. To understand how that happened, you have to start with a Dutch surname and a shoe factory in Massachusetts. The surname Van Doren is Dutch in origin, derived from the prefix van, meaning from, and doorn, the Dutch word for thorn. It is a topographic name, the kind given to families who lived near a thorn bush or thicket, and it traces back to settlements in Utrecht and North Brabant in the Netherlands, places where the ground was flat, the hedgerows were thorny, and the people who lived among them took the geography as their identity. The Van Doren family that concerns this story had been in the United States for generations by the time Paul Van Doren was born, and the world they inhabited was not agriculture, but manufacturing. Paul grew up in the Boston area and went to work young, landing a job at the Randolph Rubber Company, a shoe manufacturer in Massachusetts, where he learned every stage of the production process from raw materials to finished product. He started on the factory floor and worked his way into management, developing an intimate understanding of how shoes were made, what they cost to produce, and where the margins lived. By his early 30s, Paul had risen to become one of the most effective executives at the company, but he was increasingly frustrated by the inefficiency of the traditional shoe business model, which separated manufacturing from retail by layers of distributors, wholesalers, and middlemen who each took a cut without adding value. His idea was radical for the time: cut out every intermediary and sell shoes directly from the factory to the customer. Make them in the back, sell them in the front, and let the customer choose exactly what they wanted. In 1966, Paul convinced his younger brother James Van Doren, along with partners Gordon Lee and Serge, to pool their resources and open a factory retail store in Anaheim, California. They called it the Van Doren Rubber Company. The first day of business, March 16, 1966, set the tone for everything that followed. 12 customers walked in, selected their canvas styles and colors, and waited while the shoes were manufactured on the premises. When they went to pay, Paul realized he had forgotten to stock the register with cash for change. Rather than lose the sales, he told each customer to take the shoes and come back tomorrow to pay. All 12 returned. It was the kind of moment that gets turned into brand mythology later, but at the time it was simply a man who had forgotten to do basic arithmetic, making the best of an embarrassing situation. And a company was born on the principle that if you treat people honestly and make a product worth coming back for, the business model will sort itself out. That principle held for almost 20 years, which in the shoe business is practically an eternity. The Van Doren Rubber Company grew steadily through the late 1960s and 1970s on the strength of its direct-to-consumer model and the durability of its vulcanized rubber soles, which were thicker and grippier than anything the major shoe companies were producing. Paul opened additional factory stores across Southern California, each one following the same formula: manufacturing in the back, retail in the front, custom orders available at no extra charge. By the late 1970s, Vans operated roughly 70 stores across the state, an impressive chain for a company that had started with a single location and no outside investment. But the moment that transformed Vans from a regional shoe company into a cultural institution came from a direction that Paul Van Doren had never anticipated. In the mid-1970s, the skateboarding community in Southern California discovered that Vans' thick rubber soles gripped a board better than anything else on the market. The Z-Boys of Dogtown, the legendary Santa Monica skateboarding crew that included Tony Alva and Stacy Peralta, started wearing Vans because the shoes performed on concrete in ways that running shoes and basketball sneakers simply could not. Tony Alva approached Vans directly and collaborated on what became one of the first signature skateboarding shoes ever produced. The Vans era, designed with padded collars and a combination of suede and canvas that could withstand the punishment of daily skating. The skateboarding community adopted Vans with a loyalty that no marketing campaign could have manufactured. Skaters wore them because they worked, full stop. There was no endorsement deal, no marketing strategy, and no corporate decision to enter the skateboarding vertical. Kids bought the shoes, beat them to pieces on half-pipes and sidewalks, and bought them again. And the brand's association with the raw, anti-establishment energy of 1970s skateboarding gave Vans a credibility that no amount of advertising money could ever replicate. Then Hollywood amplified the signal in a way that nobody at the company had planned or predicted. In 1982, Sean Penn appeared in Fast Times at Ridgemont High wearing a pair of Vans checkerboard slip-ons, and the shoe went from Southern California skate parks to shopping malls across America overnight. The checkerboard pattern, originally created when customers used to draw on their own custom Vans orders, became one of the most iconic designs in footwear history. Sales surged beyond anything the company had experienced. The brand was on fire, burning through inventory faster than the Anaheim factory could produce it, and suddenly Vans was not just a California skate shoe company, but a national fashion brand with mainstream recognition. It was the best possible moment to double down on what was working. Instead, Paul Van Doren, now in his 50s and weary from 2 decades of hands-on management, made the decision that would nearly destroy everything. He stepped back from daily operations and let his younger brother James take the wheel. James Van Doren looked at the success of the early 1980s and saw opportunity in every direction. If Vans could dominate skateboarding, why not basketball, running, wrestling, and breakdancing too? Under James's leadership, the company launched an aggressive diversification campaign, expanding from its core canvas skate shoes into over 850 different styles, spanning every sport and activity that had even a tangential connection to youth culture. New stores opened at a pace of roughly 1 per week. The product line ballooned beyond anything the factory system could efficiently support. And the costs spiraled, while revenue from the new categories failed to materialize at anything close to the volume needed to justify the expansion. The core problem was that James had confused brand recognition with brand permission. Customers trusted Vans to make skateboarding shoes because Vans had earned that trust through years of product quality and cultural authenticity. They had no particular reason to trust Vans for basketball sneakers or wrestling shoes, and they did not, choosing Nike, Adidas, and Reebok instead, brands that had spent years and hundreds of millions establishing credibility in those categories. Meanwhile, cheap foreign competitors had begun flooding the American shoe market with knockoffs and budget alternatives that undercut Vans' pricing without matching the quality, but close enough that casual buyers could not tell the difference. The combination was lethal. Expenses climbing in every direction, revenue from the new categories arriving at a trickle instead of a flood, and a product line so bloated that the company had lost focus on the one thing it did better than anyone else. The stores that had once been temples to skateboarding culture were now cluttered with wrestling shoes that nobody had asked for and breakdancing sneakers that belonged in a clearance bin. On October 27, 1984, the Van Doren Rubber Company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection, carrying $12 million in total debt, including a $6.7 million loan from Security Pacific National Bank. The workforce had already been cut from 2,000 to 1,100. The store count had dropped from 70 to around 50, and the creditors, led by the bank, demanded one thing as a condition of any reorganization. James Van Doren had to go. Paul returned as president, the role he had never wanted to leave in the first place. He, Gordon Lee, and Serge bought out James's interest in the company, ending his involvement permanently and completely. The terms were not disclosed publicly, and they did not need to be, because the message was clear enough. James was out, and he was not coming back. Paul later said he had not seen his younger brother since that day. Not at holidays, not at family events, not at all. The family that had built Vans together was broken in a way that 18 years of shared work and shared risk could not repair, and no amount of vulcanized rubber could stick it back together. Paul Van Doren's turnaround strategy was the opposite of everything his brother had done. Cut, focus, and survive. He froze salaries for 3 years, starting with his own. He slashed the product line from 850 styles down to roughly 120, keeping only the shoes that customers actually wanted. He told every employee in the company to cut costs on everything except the quality of the shoe itself, because the shoe was the only thing that had ever mattered. The court approved a reorganization plan on December 9, 1985, committing Vans to repay the full $9.7 million in principal to unsecured creditors without interest over a 4-year period. The company emerged from Chapter 11 on December 20th, 1985, leaner, more focused, and stripped of every vanity project that James had layered on top of the core business. The workforce was smaller, the store count was lower, the product line was a fraction of what it had been, and it worked almost immediately. Sales stabilized, then grew, as the refocused product line reconnected with the skateboarding and youth culture communities that had made Vans relevant in the first place. But Paul was 60 years old by then, and the cumulative weight of the bankruptcy, the family rupture, the buyout, and 3 years of frozen salaries had taken its toll on a man who had been making shoes since before most of his employees were born. In 1988, Paul, Gordon Lee, and Serge sold the Van Doren Rubber Company to McCown DeLeeuw and Company, a venture banking firm, for $74.4 million. Paul stayed on as chairman and Lee as vice chairman, but the founding family no longer controlled the business. The company passed through several ownership changes over the next decade and a half before VF Corporation acquired Vans in 2004 for approximately $396 million, a five-fold increase over what McCown DeLeeuw had paid 16 years earlier. Under VF's stewardship, with its global distribution network and corporate resources behind it, Vans exploded. Revenue climbed from hundreds of millions to $2.2 billion by 2015, making it the most profitable brand in VF's entire portfolio. The checkerboard slip-ons sold in quantities that would have been unimaginable to the man who had first manufactured 12 pairs in a back room in Anaheim. The old school, the skate high, and the authentic became wardrobe staples for teenagers and adults on every continent. And through all of it, the Van Doren name stayed on the building, not as owners, but as something arguably more valuable, the family memory of a company that had outgrown them. Paul Van Doren died in May 2021 at the age of 90, having recently published his memoir, Authentic, a title that doubled as both a book name and the name of the very first Vans shoe model. He lived long enough to see the company he founded in a single Anaheim factory become one of the most recognized footwear brands on the planet, and long enough to know that his children and grandchildren were still inside the building, carrying forward something that corporate ownership could not replicate. Steve Van Doren, Paul's son, holds the title of Vice President of Events and Promotions, but his actual role is something closer to ambassador, historian, and soul of the company. He attends every major skateboarding competition, every warped tour date, every store opening, with the kind of genuine enthusiasm that cannot be faked by a corporate hire reading from a brand guidelines document. Cheryl Van Doren, Paul's daughter, serves as Vice President of Human Resources, a position that keeps the family connected to how the company treats its people, which was always the thing Paul cared about most. And the third generation has entered the building. Christy Van Doren works as Senior Director of Marketing for North America. Jenny Battiest, another grandchild, is Merchandising Manager for the Americas. Between them, the Van Dorens hold enough institutional knowledge and cultural credibility to anchor a brand that might otherwise drift into the kind of soulless corporate execution that kills companies from the inside. The irony of the Van Doren story is that losing ownership may have been the best thing that ever happened to the family's relationship with the brand. As owners, they bore the weight of every financial decision, every expansion mistake, every bankruptcy filing, and the stress of it destroyed the relationship between two brothers permanently. As employees, they carry the culture without carrying the risk, and the company benefits from their presence in ways that no quarterly earnings report can quantify. James Van Doren, the brother whose overexpansion triggered the bankruptcy and whose ouster split the family, disappeared from the Van story entirely after the buyout. Paul never spoke to him again. Two brothers built a shoe company in a factory in Anaheim, and one of them nearly destroyed it while the other saved it. And the family that survived chose to stay in the building long after the building stopped belonging to them. And now we'd love to hear from you in the comments. Is it better to own a company and carry all the risk, or to let someone else own it and simply protect the culture from the inside? We look forward to the discussion below, and thanks for joining us for another episode of Old Money Luxury. Cheers.